Hello, hello. This is Justin Coletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, I gave you a few seconds of dead air at the beginning because I'm having technical difficulties today. And I'll tell you what, my audio level is actually going to increase as we're speaking. And here we go. Yo! Thanks so much for joining me for this week's live stream podcast. And today we're going to be talking about a guy named Brian Eno, who is, I've got to say, influential to this day. He was big in the 1970s, working with some major artists. David Bowie is a big one he's renowned for working with. He did a bunch of records with INXS. He's worked with Lanois. A lot of artists that were very forward-thinking for their time and kind of out-of-the-box artists. And even today, he's producing records and mixing, in the past decade. He's been doing significant work. But he's also been speaking more and more about music production and mixing and what it means to make art, what it means to make music. But probably one of the things that is part of his biggest legacy in music, almost as big as some of his records, at least among creative types, is his Oblique Strategies card deck. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. I'm going to pull up for you some examples of his Oblique Strategies. This is a version of his actual physical cards that you can still buy to this day from Eno's shop. Original printings of these cards are probably in the thousands of dollars if you were to buy them, but you can buy these now for $50, or you don't have to buy them at all because there's so many great online emulations of this card deck. You can get them as apps. You can go over to websites that allow you to flip through them. And this is designed as almost a miniature card game for musicians, producers, engineers, and they're meant to be a tool to use in the studio. Now, why are these so memorable decades after they were created? Are they useful today? Is this a fun and interesting way to spend some of your time, potentially some of your money, or potentially $0 with all of the free versions of these that are online now? I'm going to say yes. I was first clued into these, I want to say, way back around the year 2000 or so. When I was in college, I remember learning about these. One of my professors told me about them. I thought, that's a neat idea. And just from hearing the idea of how this card game is meant to work and a few examples of what's in it, it had an impact on my brain and how it works. But I've got to tell you, that was about 20 years ago that I first heard about these cards and first heard a lot of the little mini games that are in it. And only now, 20 years later, did I actually go through the deck. I believe more than 100 prompts crafted for musicians and mixers and engineers, and actually went through the process of messing around with them. And I want to take you through that process with me. We'll go through some of these cards together, and we'll get a sense for whether you think it's going to be useful. I've got to say, even if you just spend several hours with these cards, I think they can make you potentially more creative for life. Like, it really is one of those experiences. Now, before we get into it, the only thing I've got to do is give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. And our sponsors are, as always, the most important ones being you. How do you sponsor this podcast? Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, make me feel better, even though I had dead air for the first few seconds of today's podcast, and my color correction isn't great today, and all of my computers are blowing up on me, but we're doing a podcast episode anyway. If that's valuable to you, hit like, hit subscribe, hit the notifications bell so you don't miss any more great episodes. Also, check out something even greater than any of these episodes. Check out some of our full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ breakthroughs, and so on. Check them out over at members.sonicscoop.com, where you can get streaming access to all of them, as well as become a part of our membership community, where you can get feedback on your mixes, ask questions, get immediate answers, and so much more. Also, big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's get right back into the meat of today's episodes. And I have not only one of these Oblique Strategies decks here, at least a digital version of that we can go through together. I also have picked out some of my favorites that had some of the biggest impact for me. So what is the Oblique Strategies card deck? What kind of game is it? And what are you meant to do with it? It's actually extremely simple. Really all that it is this deck of, I think, about 100 or so cards made in 1975, and they just have one sentence or sentence fragment prompts. And these are meant to be kind of a challenge and response that you give yourself when you're in the studio and you're reaching loggerheads with either yourself or another musician in the room. And the idea is to draw one card, just any card at random, and not only just obey the card, but kind of figure out what the card means and what direction it could take you. And I've got to say, the card format is absolutely the best format for this kind of exercise, because it really is a meditative experience where any one of these cards you pull out, you should probably look at it for about a minute and think about what it means. They are brilliantly crafted prompts. If you've gone through the Oblique Strategies in the past yourself, let me know in the comments or in the chat, what are some of your favorite prompts in this deck? And what are some that you would add to it? Maybe we can make up our own Oblique Strategies 2.0 by getting enough comments and chats in with good ideas on this same front. This is one of my favorite ones that first came up to me from a mixing perspective. This prompt is shut the door and listen from outside. This is actually really good advice just as a mixing engineer in general. I don't necessarily recommend shutting the door, but getting up out of your chair and going outside the door and hearing your mix from outside a door, man, absolutely huge. Absolutely mega important in changing the way that you evaluate your mix. And there's certain mixers that bake this approach into their everyday work. One of them is Michael Brauer, who spends a lot of his time, if you're not familiar with him, Michael Brauer is one of the most probably influential mixers of the past 40 years or so, and a great guy for talking about mixing as well as actually mixing. And he spends a lot of his time monitoring off of a boombox that is off to one side. So he's getting kind of acoustic mono. So a stereo boombox halfway across the room is one of his main monitoring sources. He has nice, fancy, high-end studio monitors in front of him, giving the full stereo spread, but he also has a set of speakers halfway across the room that he's told me, a majority of his mixing on. That's where he wants to make sure it sounds cool. Now, this takes it one step further. Shut the door and listen from outside. This brings us to something that might be useful not just for mixers. I think it's a little extreme if you're actually trying to get a good mix. But as a musician, when you listen to your music from outside, what does it sound like? Man, this is something that could give you a totally new perspective on the arrangement and about what is and isn't working in the low end and what's important in the low end. So I can just click here again, and it's like drawing another card. Don't stress one thing more than another. Man, from a mixing perspective, I would actually think that this is horrible advice. Don't stress one thing more than another. Often, I think the best mixes come from stressing one thing more than another, of kind of directing people's attention to what is most important. And I got to tell you, one person who does that a lot in his mixes is Brian Eno. Brian Eno, if you listen to some of his early mixes with David Bowie in the 1970s, he has synths come in that are louder than the rest of the entire song put together. So he's definitely someone who stresses one thing more than another. But with that said, is this supposed to apply only to mixing? What are contexts in which this would make sense? And I think that's the way that you've got to read the Oblique Strategies, is not just to argue with them, but to think about, in what context is this true? And how could this be true for me right now? Don't stress one thing more than another. Interesting. Maybe sometimes the things that we think we should be stressing aren't the things that we should be stressing. All right, let's go through some more cards. You don't have to be ashamed of using your own ideas. So this one is interesting. This one is exactly the opposite of another prompt that's in here, which is one of my favorite prompts that's in here, is don't be afraid of using cliches. Two exactly opposite prompts in the same deck. Are both of them true? Yes. So I think don't be afraid of using cliches. That's a big one. Like sometimes if we're getting like too super creative, we start to eschew everything that actually makes music work. Everything that actually makes sense in our genre. We try a little bit too hard to be creative and we ignore like what actually makes music good because of how obsessed we are with wanting to feel original. But the exact opposite can happen to us. You don't have to be ashamed of using your own ideas. Just because someone else hasn't done it before doesn't mean it's bad. It's actually a pretty good high likelihood that it is bad, but it doesn't mean that it is. But what else could this mean? You don't have to be ashamed of using your own ideas. Sometimes we get sucked into collaborations, right? We're sucked into a collaboration with others, which is extremely useful. We should probably collaborate with people even more. But if we're super hyper agreeable, we might be constantly deferring to others and their ideas and not wanting to act like our idea is more important and better than others. I mean, maybe you have the exact opposite problem. But this could be exactly what you need to hear. Into the impossible. Leaning into things that you supposedly can't do. This one feels a little bit corny to me. But if we were to stop criticizing for a second and think about, okay, how could this be useful? How could this be true? And if we start to approach this deck with that positive attitude of, oh, okay, my initial impulse is this one sounds a little cliched and cheesy. But wait a second, I just said, don't be afraid of cliches is one of the most powerful pieces of advice in here. And this is rubbing me the wrong way because it seems like a cliche. How can I reimagine this cliche as being true? Into the impossible. I mean, it sounds like a corny tagline to, The Incredibles 3. Incredibles, by the way, is an incredible movie. Into the impossible. Maybe leaning into things that are impossible. I've created a list of some of my own favorites that I'm going to read off to you right now. Some of the ones that were most impactful to me. The one that I remember hearing when I was in my early 20s that made the idea of this Oblique Strategies card deck stick in my mind for years to come was this one. Honor your error as a hidden intention. That is probably one of my favorites of the Oblique Strategies from Brian Eno. Honor your error as hidden intention. I'm going to pretend that my error at the beginning of this podcast, where I couldn't get my color correction settings to come up properly on my camera, and I couldn't get my mic working for the first few seconds of this podcast, I'm going to honor that as a hidden intention. No, that's not a hidden intention at all. But I make constant mistakes when I do these live stream podcast episodes. I've been doing them as a live stream for a year, or has it been 2 years? I can't remember when I switched the format. But 1 year I said, January 1st of this year, I'm starting to do every single podcast episode as a live stream. And I've made so many mistakes. But I just keep going anyway. And there's one thing that I remember my professor in college who was telling me about the whole card deck. His name is Jim McElwain. He's still out there, I think, teaching to this day, even though he's probably now in his mid to late 70s. At least last time I checked in with him, he was. One of the greatest pieces of advice he ever gave me, he was the one who told me about this deck. He said, Justin, one of the best things you can do if you ever hit a wrong note is to hit it again. I love that one. One of the best things you can do if you hit a wrong note is to hit it again. Sometimes the best thing to do with a mistake is to draw attention to it and to make fun of it and to make light of it and to build around the mistake, to build around the accident. And to turn the accident, the mistake, the moment of awkwardness into the whole point. But playing a wrong note twice, the second time even more confidently than the first, is what makes wrong notes sound right. And there are certain players who are amazing at this. One of my favorite guitar players of all time, a guy named Mark Ribot. He played guitar on most of the biggest Tom Waits records. Things like Rain Dogs, Swordfish Trombones, Frank's Wild Ears. And all of his guitar solos feel like him playing every note that's not in the key. It almost feels like he's figuring out what a normal person would play as a guitar solo and then playing around that, like playing in the holes that they would have left. That's a man who knows how to play the wrong note loudly with intention more than once, so it feels oh so incredibly right. There's another one in here that is along the same theme. So sometimes there's multiple cards in here that touch on the same theme from a different angle. Look closely at the most embarrassing details and amplify them. Wow, it's feeling more and more fortuitous that I messed up at the beginning of my live stream. Look closely at the most embarrassing details and amplify them. Another one of my favorites here, because Brian Eno has given advice that I've given and will continue to give, which is be bored. Two of the oblique strategies in here that come up speak to this so well. One is a card that just says, do something boring on it. I think that's extremely useful advice when we're stuck in a production and we don't know where to go. We can't hear anything properly anymore. We don't even know it sounds good anymore. Go do something boring. Go do something boring is great advice for if you're having trouble actually having the discipline to sit down and do music production, to actually put your hours in to get better at the craft. Do something boring. Honestly, boredom is one of the most important things to an artist. Because if you constantly stimulate yourself with other people's art, constantly nonstop, there's very little room for you to think your own thoughts, to be so annoyed at how quiet the world is that you want to put some sound into it. Boredom is almost like the genesis point of good art. Another one he has on there that is along the same tip is do nothing for as long as possible. This one dovetails nicely into do something boring. It's the ultimate do something boring, right? And this reminds me of advice that I got from a book, a decent book that you can read called Effortless Mastery. I believe it's by a pianist named Kenny Werner. Anyone feel free to correct me in the chat or the comments if I have that right or wrong. But one of the things that Kenny gave as advice in his book was if you're having trouble practicing as a musician, and this could go for people who are meaning to produce records and aren't getting as many done as they like, or aren't finishing things. He said he had a lot of trouble sitting down and actually practicing as a kid, but he made a deal with himself at a certain point, which was to say, every day I'm going to sit down at the piano for at least 5 minutes. And here's the thing. I don't have to play, but I can't do anything else. Imagine if you did that in your own life, in your own craft. Imagine if you sat down, if you're having trouble finishing or having trouble getting started on your own productions, or having trouble sitting down for songwriting sessions and making them happen. Sometimes it's because it's so daunting. This idea of sitting down and actually getting the thing done and creating something that you have to be judged by and knowing that you might be in that chair struggling for an hour or 2 hours or more. What if you didn't promise yourself that you had to sit in the chair for 3 hours? What if you said you have to sit down for 5 minutes and you don't have to work on music today, but in those 5 minutes, you can't do anything else? And your two choices are sit down there for 5 minutes and don't do anything musical, or you end up starting. And what this guy found out for himself, and I found it out for myself, is if you just sit down with the idea of I'm not allowed to do I don't have to do this, but I can't do anything else, you're probably going to sit down and do the thing you were supposed to do. And now if you actually work on it for 10 or 15 minutes, that is a success rather than a failure. Like if you're trying to build a practice habit, or if you're trying to build a music production habit, the only way you're going to get good at things, to do them consistently again and again and again. If you tell yourself, I'm going to sit down for 2 hours and then you don't, or I have to work on this for 4 hours today and then you don't, because that's something that really happens to people. Start with a much smaller goal and then work up from there. It's huge. Another good one in here that really spoke to me on that same front was tidy up. Man, that's something I could do a lot more often in the studio. Let's bring back up the Safari share here. In just a second, I'm going to go to your comments. So tell me if any of these things stood out to you more than others so far. And tell me if you have your own ideas along these lines that we could add to a future Oblique Strategies deck. I'm not going to go through every single one of these because the podcast episode would actually go really long. But I think it'd be fun to just go through a few more together and play this card game together and think together about what they mean. And let me know in the chat which of these Oblique Strategies you respond the most to and what they make you think of that I might not have touched on. Give the game away. That's interesting. What does this mean in the context of you writing music or arranging music or mixing? Oh man, so many things come to mind for me off of this one. Give the game away. Honestly, when it comes to mixing, which is where I'll start, this is one of the most important things, I think, as a mixer, is it is your job to draw people's attention to what's most important in the mix that's going to give them the most emotional impact in that moment or in that section. Your job is not to make everything equally loud at all times so we can hear everything clearly at once and create some big soup. No, it's to help people figure out what the main game is in this song. What are the primary aspects of the game being played right now that we can draw their attention to? Give the game away. What could this mean in songwriting or arranging? Particularly in arranging. Do you have a great hook? How long are you going to make me wait for it? If you ever watch a musical, one of the big things that happens at the beginning of almost every musical, and I think most operas too, right, would be an overture, right, where they start off by playing little melodic snippets of every song that we're going to hear eventually in the musical. And this is big, because the first time you hear this overture, you might not even be cued in to like all of these melodies, and most of them might just wash over to you. You might not even consciously recognize them. But then when you finally actually hear the songs for the first time in this musical, they are somewhat familiar because you have heard them once before already. Is there a point to this song? Is there a huge payoff for this song? How long are you going to make me wait for it and why? Now, it's true. You can arrange songs. There's no wrong here. You can arrange songs where the main payoff doesn't happen until 3 minutes in. That's possible. Most of your favorite really, really big songs don't do that, however. And even if they do have a really big payoff 3 minutes in, if they're one of your favorites, chances are there were many little payoffs along the way. And this idea of giving the game away, stating a theme early on in a minor way before you state it later in a major way, that's one of the ideas that comes to me when I just look at these 4 words, give the game away. Let's keep on playing. Let's draw another one. Ghost echoes. Now, this one seems almost obvious to me in a world where we've had digital delays now for 50 years. But that wasn't the world that Brian Eno was working in. Ghostly echoes in 1975, when they're creating this, that had been done on several records. Right? This one maybe doesn't feel as mind-blowing to me, but maybe ghostly echoes are something that's missing from your song. Is there some way in which ghostly echoes would be right with the production you're working on? But here's the thing. You don't have to have these cards be your boss. So you could say, for this production, no, it's not about ghost echoes. Let me put that back in. But first, you've got to just play the game of saying, how would this be right? If this was going to be right for this song, how would it be right? This is interesting. This one's very enigmatic to me. You can only make one dot at a time. What does that one even mean? For this one, I'm not going to give you my opinion because this one is not conjuring for me something really obvious that I can bring out of my mental music production toolkit. This was one that I'd actually have to sit down and think about for a second. Now, I really understand how this would work for a visual artist. Here's a rule you're going to give yourself for this next phase of this drawing. You can only make one dot at a time. You're not allowed to use lines. You have to use disconnected points. How would that work in music? You can only make one dot at a time. Would this mean, maybe, if you know how to work with staff paper, would this encourage you to say, wait a second, I've been working so much at just playing at the instrument, taking my guitar, which I know so well, or taking my keyboard, which I know so well, and doing things with my hands and playing multiple notes at once, or if I'm a singer, creating lines. wait a second, what if I backed up and say, no, I'm going to write this one in MIDI, one note at a time, adding note by note and thinking about what dot should come next. And stopping every time to say, is that the right dot? Is that the ideal dot? This is a totally different way of writing than shredding on guitar or playing at the piano or just, vamping vocal lines and ad-libbing melodic lines. If you had to create a piece one dot at a time, one note at a time, either on a MIDI roll or on staff paper, if you're good with staff paper, that would be a way it could apply to music production and to writing or to arranging. How could it apply to mixing? One way that I could think about applying to mixing is something I recommend in the Mixing Breakthroughs course. There's some exercises in there which I think will completely change the way that you mix forever for the better. Is actually, I'm realizing now going through this, how influenced I am by the Oblique Strategies and some of what's in Mixing Breakthroughs, because the first 5 modules of Mixing Breakthroughs are about creating exercises for you to do that will make you better at mixing forever. And one of them is to use all of our processors in a sequence. There's a set of exercises where you're first allowed to use nothing but faders and pan. Then you're allowed to use nothing but EQ. Then you're allowed to use nothing but compression. Then you're allowed to use nothing but time-based effects in that order. And there's specific reasons for why that order and what to listen for. So that's kind of a guided exercise. But there's exercises like this in Mixing Breakthroughs. And if you go through the exercises, there's a lot more detail in the exercises that I'm giving right now. I'm kind of sketching a vague outline for you. But if you actually do the exercises that are in that course, I think you'll have the experience that thousands of people have had before, which is it changes the way that they mix forever for the better. I think this one can be adapted to mixing, and the closest I think I've ever seen to it adapting to it for mixing is that series of exercises at the beginning of Mixing Breakthroughs. I think it's super useful. I'm not going to give you again all the details on what those exercises are, because then you're more likely to go buy the course and find out what they are. But I guarantee you won't regret it if you do, and there's a money-back guarantee on it, as well as all the other courses. All right, just a couple more of these, maybe 3 more, and then I'm going to go to your comments. This one is interesting. Balance the consistency principle with the inconsistency principle. Never in this deck of cards does Brian Eno tell us what the consistency principle is and what the inconsistency principle is. Why doesn't it say balance consistency with inconsistency? Are we just being pretentious here, fleshing it out? This is me being negative and arguing with the card. But all right, we're going to play the game. How would this be true? Let me pretend that I already know what the consistency principle is. What is the consistency principle? Well, it depends. What are we talking about? Are we talking about getting good at something? The consistency principle, sitting down again and again, day after day, coming back and getting 1% better every day until you look back 5 years later and say, oh my goodness, I can actually do this thing. And I came from nothing. That's one consistency principle. But is there a consistency principle in music? The consistency of repetition, of coming back to the same refrain again and again. So what would the inconsistency principle mean in the context of music? The inconsistency principle in the context of learning is there are certain leapfrog moments, right? We have these certain moments where we've been going at a certain pace and then we leapfrog all at once. And doing something like spending a handful of hours with the Oblique Strategies deck and just thinking through these prompts, spending a few minutes on each of them, just kind of as a meditative experience, could be a leapfrog moment that changes the way that you think about music production. I'm not exaggerating. For a deck of 50 cards with 100 sentences on it, it really can reframe your thinking. Another thing would be like any of the breakthroughs courses. Again, I'm going to plug my stuff. Mixing breakthroughs, compression breakthroughs, EQ breakthroughs, any of those courses. But not just those. People have seen our MixCon masterclasses. There's tons of free stuff where there are like leapfrogs, these mini eurekas. So there's inconsistency in learning as well, right? Learning happens bit by bit by bit and then seemingly all at once. But it's not all at once. Something was unlocked after so much build. A breaking point hits. And those were the leapfrog moments come out of inconsistency on top of consistency. Inconsistent spurts of inspiration on top of consistent foundations. So within music, the inconsistency principle, man, what would this be? This would be those moments of ear candy, that little kind of vocoder sound that happens only twice in your entire song, maybe the more consistent your song is, and this you'll see this a lot in EDM, where you can have a really consistent song in the sense of there's this backdrop, there's this loop that goes throughout practically the entire song. There's this drum beat that practically doesn't change. The chord changes basically don't change. The main melodic themes basically don't change. But in that context, we're allowed to have moments that appear and never come back. So how can you think about, all right, where are you? Is your song currently leaning more towards consistency or more towards inconsistency? And how can you balance it slightly back in the other direction by taking your overly consistent song and adding inconsistent flourishes that aren't meant to be there forever in the song? Or vice versa, you're so incredibly inconsistent, maybe it's time to embrace some cliches, embrace some structure, and take this wild stallion of creative energy you have and put it within a course that it has to run. So those are some of my thoughts here. Let's see if any good chats are coming in here about people that we're adding, who are adding their own thoughts here. Higher Ground says, each sound we hear is a dot. It's true, man, but like, where does one sound begin and one other sound end, dude? DDY says, you can only make one dot at a time could refer to choices or changes. Yeah, this idea of, man, list making being so big in mixing and music production. Sometimes, I mean, this is one of the worst things that you can get into, I think, when it comes to especially revising mixes. You have like 9 ideas that you want to do. Or even if you only have 3, you're like, oh, I know the 3 things that I want to do in this mix are this, this, and this. And then you start going in and you start doing one thing and then you start doing like 12 others. But if you actually write these things down, literally as bullet points, as dots on your list, and then go through and literally check them off one at a time. Okay, the kick drum sound should be less clicky. Let me just focus on this and nothing else. If it's not the actual words that I'm staring at on paper right now, I'm not doing it. I'm just focusing on the kick drum click. Yes, there's a million other things I know that I could tweak in this mix. But none of those are the things that I've already evaluated and said actually are important to change. And let me just focus on that dot and not get distracted by everything else. And when I'm done with it, I'm going to the next dot. And then when I'm all out of dots, I'm going to go away. I'm not going to tweak anything. I'm going to go away and listen in a new way, maybe outside the room, outside of the door, and create a new set of dots that now I have to work through again. That'd be another great way to think about it. My Resonant Frequencies writes in to say, I often get sounds while washing dishes or showering, opens up a new portal to new tones and melodies. Absolutely, man. Getting up and walking around is one of the best things for creative blocks, mixing blocks. I think listening to music in a totally different space is huge. Like if you can get a couch in your room and have more than one listening position where you have your chair that you listen on and you have your couch in the back of the room that you lay down and listen on. Or you have a chair outside the door that you listen on. A lot of us do this by taking a walk with headphones. That was one of my biggest things when I lived in the city and I was mixing in Brooklyn for a long time is I would take off my mixes, I would do the best mixing that I could, and then I would take it for a walk on headphones with a notepad. And I did some of my best mixing when I wasn't mixing, when I was listening on this set of consumer headphones. And it wasn't just that I was having an alternate reference through these headphones. It was also that I wasn't allowed to touch anything. All I could do was create dots to work on. And sometimes you do your best mixing when you're not mixing because you're no longer fiddling. You're no longer in fiddling mode. You're actually in listening and evaluating mode and responding emotionally. One of my other favorite strategies in here is ask your body. That is so big. This is something that I'm always consulting when I'm working on mastering records. I always am asking myself, when I make this change, is my body moving more or less? If I find myself involuntarily moving my body in sync with the music more after a change, I 100% know it's a change in the right direction. And if I ever find movement in sync with the music and then I start doing less of it because of changes I'm making, I know that they're the wrong changes. Regardless of how impressive or interesting something sounds. Oh, I made the low end so much more impressive and the high end so much more sparkly, but I started moving my body less. Whoa, wrong. Take it back. I made it so much wider and louder and bigger, but my body is moving less. Roll it back. No. Hey, these changes actually made the record more mid-rangier. It made this sound smaller, but now I'm bobbing. I'm like nodding. Yes, more of that. I don't care how crappy my engineer friends are going to think it sounds if they evaluate it under a microscope. Doesn't matter. Heads are nodding. Toes are tapping. Fingers are drumming. Win. Ooh, here's a couple more goodies. I'll give you two more of my favorites, and then we'll call it a day for now. And for these, I'm not going to give you my answers. I could give you long-winded answers on each of these. This is such a fun exercise for me. I haven't thought about any of these answers in advance. I'm literally just going through this deck with you. In addition to just going through it randomly, some of them, grabbing some that just immediately spoke to me. I said, oh, I know this is fertile. Let me think of what they mean live on the stream. One of my other favorites that I'll let you give your own answer on, because I want to hear from you guys in the chat or in the comments. Here it is. Not building a wall, but making a brick. So, I said I wasn't going to say anything about it. Sometimes I will anyway. Sometimes we actually do this wrong. We focus too much on the bricks, especially when we're mixing. We focus too much on the bricks. Like we get so zeroed in and we spend an hour on the kick drum in solo when we should be thinking about, do we even need to spend an hour on the kick drum in solo? We should be thinking about how the kick drum sits in context. And it doesn't matter how bright and clicky the kick drum is if the kick drum shouldn't be so audible in this particular track. And your default thing is just, I make great sounding kick drums, regardless of whether they're appropriate for the track or not. That's not necessarily good. Not building a wall, but making a brick. But why would this be right? In what context would it be right? Try to think of it for production, arranging, mixing, and songwriting. And one more for you. This is a good one. Be less critical more often. Does this apply to yourself? It could. Does it apply to the art of others? Oh man, I told you I wasn't going to say anything, but this just conjures up immediately so much stuff for me. You know, the competitiveness we get into with other artists. I always like to say that musicians' favorite artists are almost always dead artists because they're no longer competition. There are so many musicians, so many of us who have trouble respecting and admiring the work of living musicians and artists, particularly who are somewhat in our genre. Now, some people might have the opposite problem. They develop hero complex of others and they think, oh, I'm not good enough. There are these people who are doing great things and I can't match them. And sometimes that'll hold you back. And sometimes the anger that you have for there not being stuff that you'd want to listen to can drive you. But what could it mean to be less critical more often? Is being too critical too often the main cause of your procrastination, the main cause of you not finishing? Is your constant criticism of others backfiring onto yourself? And are you so afraid of criticism from others, possibly because of how much you criticize others, that you can't even take your work to other people who can help you finish it? That's another one of the oblique strategies in here, which is, I believe it was something along the lines of take advice or accept advice. All right, a couple more random ones and I'm done. Remove specifics and convert to ambiguities. I think he has in here also the exact opposite of that. Converting ambiguities into specifics. Consult other sources. Promising, unpromising. What does that mean and in what context and how could that be the right advice? Now, there's a couple ways to work with this deck, and we'll wrap it up here. You could go ahead and buy a physical version of this deck, and I think the person who that's appropriate for, one, people who like physical experiences, two, people who have money to waste, but also three, studio owners. If you're working collaboratively with others, I think that's where this deck can be a lot of fun. I mean, it's a good conversation starter or icebreaker in the studio. Just this idea of you don't go through the entire deck, but you pull out one card or two cards or three cards and try to think about how one of those could be the right advice for what you're doing right now. Or you can even just have a conversation about it. Having a physically beautiful deck in a studio where a lot of people work together and collaborate together, I think that is super useful to have. And in that context, you could be one of two ways. You could never read these until they pop up because one of your clients or one of your collaborators is in the studio and takes the card out. Or you could be the kind of nerd like me who would go through every single card and try to think about what they mean. So this is the other way to deal with them. And you could do it with physical cards, or you could do it with something like this. I'll share this link with you guys in the comments and in the description. Here's one of many auto generators for the Oblique Strategies. And you can kind of go through each of them. There's also another version that I'll link to that's just a PDF of all of them, and you can print them out and just cut them out. Or you could potentially read through them. It turns out to be like 11 pages if you stack them into individual cards on a bunch of pages. And you could read through all of them. And if you were to do that, I really think you have to end up spending 2 or 3 minutes meditating on the idea. You could even set a timer if you have trouble spending that long meditating on an idea, to set a timer for each card. So it's not just, this is not something you passively consume, right? This is not something you read through. Oh, I read through the 100 prompts. I'm done now. Now I know more. Nah, that's not how it works. This deck only works if you sit there with a prompt for at least a minute and say, what does this mean? And how and when could it be right? And how could it be right now? And if it's not right now, I have to at least figure out under what conditions it would be right before I say it's wrong for me. Even just training your brain to think in that way, I think makes you more creative overall. Well, I hope this walk through the Oblique Strategy deck has been fun for you guys. It's been fun for me to kind of yammer through this with you. If you want something that's like this, that is targeted completely at mixing, I recommend taking the Mixing Breakthroughs course. Also compression breakthroughs, EQ breakthroughs, mastering demystified. Each one of them is guaranteed to change the way that you work forever for the better. Guaranteed or your money back. Mixing Breakthroughs has these exercises, like I said, that are designed to change the way that you think about mixing completely. Because honestly, a lot of the skill issue that we have in mixing, some of it comes from just not having enough practice at it yet. That's a part of it. And therefore not having enough skill at it yet. Or maybe not having enough technical knowledge. That's all possible. But one of the biggest things that holds people back in mixing are mindsets that kill good mixes. Once you have the right mental scaffolding, like a mental framework in place for mixing, once you have a system and a roadmap to mixing, it allows you to mix more creatively than ever before, with more confidence than ever before, and more quickly than ever before, while getting better results. Are all four of those things possible at once? And the answer is absolutely yes. Some people will say, how am I supposed to mix faster and better at the same time? That seems wrong. It's like, no, other way around. Wait, you're saying I need a system, a roadmap? How am I supposed to have a system for mixing and be more creative at the same time? Those seem at odds. No, other way around. You got to build a sandbox before you can play in the sandbox. You ain't going to be building any castles and chasing any dragons until you have the sandbox built to play in. Similarly, you're not going to be creative unless you are working quickly and not getting bogged down in the technical. And you're not going to mix well until you're mixing quickly and creatively and more instinctively and like an artist and a little bit like a technician, because you took the technician part and front-loaded that in the process, which is one of the things we teach you how to do in Mixing Breakthroughs, along with, of course, a whole bunch of tips and tricks and techniques and technical stuff. Similar stuff happens in compression breakthroughs and EQ breakthroughs. There's these guiding listening exercises But not only the guided listening exercises, before them, there's the mental framework. Okay, what are we listening for? When we're trying to compare a fast attack to a slow attack in a compressor, what are the changes I should be listening to be able to hear? Fast release versus slow release. Once you understand what you're listening for, the guided listening exercises become so much more powerful. And then once you hear these things, it's hard to unhear them. Same thing with EQ breakthroughs. People get so daunted by the idea of, oh, I have to learn how to distinguish 400 hertz from 500 hertz, and you actually don't. You do, however, have to be able to distinguish between lows, mids, and highs. And once you get there, between lower lows and upper lows, lower highs and upper highs. And once you get there, between your low mids and your upper mids, but that breaks apart. And you can start to learn the difference between low mids, center mids, and upper mids. And once you can clearly say to yourself, okay, I heard a sound, or I hear a change that I want to make, I know which of those 7 bands it falls into. Broad bands. Is it low lows or upper lows? Is it low mids, center mids, or upper mids? Is it upper highs or lower highs? Once you're able to do that kind of thing, and then once you get there, you can break it down even further. And the frameworks and the guided listening exercises that are inside of EQ breakthroughs will allow you to do that, I think, better than you ever have in your entire life. So big shout out also to those courses. Big shout out to you. If you want really concrete, specific feedback on your mixes, consider becoming a member of the SonicScoop community over at members.sonicscoop.com. Sign up for the SonicScoop Audio Accelerator, where we do regular mixing challenges, mix feedback sessions, where you can learn from real-time changes on your mixes and the mixes of others in the community, as well as Q&As with guaranteed answers to your questions, all sorts of stuff. So check that out over at SonicScoop.com, members.sonicscoop.com. Or if you don't want to pay for anything, just hit like and subscribe and hit the share button, the notifications bell, spread the word about the podcast. It really does help. And last but not least, big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys for making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything that they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. So big shout out and thanks to those guys as well. Thank you again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Coletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.